Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week's video, I'm going to call it something like how to paint a tree. But it's not going to be a typical YouTube tutorial. There are hundreds, probably thousands of YouTube videos how to paint this or that or whatever it is. And I'm sure there are at least a few on how to paint a tree. In this video, instead, what I want to do is to convince you that your approach to painting trees is the most valid and the most authentic approach for you. And you don't have to follow anybody else's step-by-step sort of process. The other thing is that step-by-step, that approach to art, I would argue, is not art. Art is not some sort of mechanical process where you feed in a bunch of stuff, crank a handle, and art pops out the other side. You can't do art in a step one, do this, step two, step three. It's not how it works, in my opinion. So is there a correct way to paint a tree? Definitely not. There's many different ways to paint trees as there are artists. That's one of the things I want to try and get across in this video. We're going to look at some examples by different artists. So only one correct way to paint a tree. Again, no, there are many, many different ways, and there's no such thing as the correct way to do art anyway, in my opinion. And then, is your painting of a tree valid? That's an important question. A lot of people, when they're getting started out, will not consider themselves as artists, that their art is not valid in some way. And if I can do anything in this little video is to try and convince people that it's the wrong way to think about your art. All art is valid because all art is just an expression of your individual creativity, your individuality as a human being. That's what art is. I say it's not a mechanical step one, step two, step three type of process. It's about expressing yourself. And each of us are unique in some way. So that's what I'm trying to do in this video. On the left, you can see an example of a painting of some trees. This is by the English artist David Hockney. I picked this one as an example. It's an interesting use of color. He has some analogous color schemes going on, sort of blues, yellows, and greens, but he also has some complementary colors going on. So the orange and purple, for example. It's a very interesting use of color. We can obviously see these are trees. There's a little trackway and some trees that have been cut down. But it's not a purely representational painting. It's not a naturalistic painting. And his use of color is certainly not naturalistic. By naturalistic, I mean this approach to art where you're trying to recreate the real world as naturally as possible. It's one way of making art. It is not the only way of making art. Second example, this one is much more naturalistic. This is by, again, an English artist. This one's Constable. So we're going back a couple of hundred years or so. And you can see that what I mean by naturalistic is the colors that he's using are much closer to the real world. He doesn't have any complementary color schemes going on or anything like that. It's much more browns, greens, blues, that type of thing. It's one way of approaching art, and it's a valid way, but it is not the only valid way. If you want to make art like this, my advice would be the first thing you're going to have to do is really get to grips with things like values and colors. Whatever medium you're using, you'll have to really master that. And things like perspective as well. You're going to have to really study that. Linear perspective. It's one way of making art. Again, it's not the only way. My problem with naturalistic art is there's no individuality. There isn't really any creativity, or very little creativity, because, comparing it to David Hockney's painting before, he had a creative use of color, an artistic use of color. Whereas the naturalistic approach is just copying what you see exactly in the real world. So there isn't any choice. And that lack of choice, in my mind, is a bad thing in art. But that's just my subjective opinion. Everybody has different ideas. Another example, very different. This one is by the Dutch artist Mondrian. Mondrian is a very interesting artist to study and to see the way his art developed from his early days, sort of late 19th century, through until the later stages of his career, his life as an artist in the early 20th century. And the way his art developed and moving away from purely representational art towards much more abstract art. And you can see this painting of a tree is somewhere in the middle of that process. And he's definitely not just going for a representational, naturalistic approach to painting. There's something else going on here. And he's exploring things. And again, this is why I don't like naturalistic art. There's no room for exploration or experimentation. There's no room for individual expression, really. But anyway, I don't want this video to become a rant against naturalism, but it's not my favorite type of art. This one's much more interesting to me. And again, it's this idea that you can experiment, you can be individual, you can try different things. You don't just have to follow the step-by-step naturalistic outcome type of approach to art. You can explore different things. One of the things to explore, for example, is the real world is three-dimensional, but we're painting onto flat canvases or flat pieces of paper very often. So how do you deal with that? Do you try and create the illusion of the third dimension, or do you embrace the fact, as I think Mondrian is here, that we're working on two-dimensional surface, and just go with that and explore that idea? You can explore the idea of using color, what colors represent to us. Do we have to stick to naturalistic colors? Can we experiment a bit? These are all interesting things to consider. A couple of my own examples, just as more examples of different ways in which you can approach painting a tree or anything else. The one on the left is kind of a portrait of a tree. Why not? We can do portraits of people or animals. Why not do portraits of a mountain or portraits of a tree or whatever? Cézanne was obsessed with a particular mountain, for example, and painted it many, many times. You can paint portraits of the natural world as well. On the right, a little bit different, more of a sketch, and it might become a painting. One of the things that interests me is the idea of the natural world. So I live in Ireland, and the Irish landscape, for the most part, is not natural. Most of it is man-made. There's a bit of natural stuff in there, but all the divisions into fields and things, this was all done by people over many centuries. So that's an interesting idea. And it's something you can explore through art. Then the final one, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. I did a video on this a few years ago, so if you're really interested, you can dig up that old video. This is just willow charcoal on white paper. And again, another way to draw or paint a tree. So briefly sum up, the main thing I was trying to get across is that there isn't one way to paint a tree. Whatever way that you paint and draw trees at this moment in time is valid. It's an authentic approach. It's your way of painting and drawing. So don't feel as though, your art is somehow less valid than other people's. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can't be inspired by other people and develop your skills and knowledge. But at any given stage in your art career, your art is valid as long as you're being authentic to yourself and not just following this mechanical step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of way of making images. If you made it this far in the video, Thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.